Welcome back to part 3 of our series, where we are going over how I manage my YouTube channel using Python. And so we are now officially in the series or the portion of the series where we are talking about the YouTube aspect of it, right? So naturally, it's a YouTube channel. There's a lot that comes in the form of managing that content using Python. So naturally, it's going to be helpful if we kind of walk through what does that code look like? What are some common operations I would maybe want to do with my content? And how can we build in that automation aspect? So we are focusing at this portion on the YouTube API. The YouTube API, at least the data portion of it, is focused on taking content, whether it be user-specific content or publicly available content, and performing different operations on it. That might mean something like creating new content. So maybe I'm going to upload a new video. I could modify existing content. So for example, I can take a description and I can say, hey, I want to modify that description. I can delete existing content. So I can say, you know what? I don't like that video anymore. I'm going to delete it. And there's also things where I can replace existing content. So I can say, hey, I want to delete that one and replace it with this one. Lots of different operations that you can do. Some of those operations are going to be restricted to you. For example, as much as I would love people going on there and just modifying my videos, I probably don't want that because you don't know what they're going to be modifying. So some of those operations you won't be able to do to someone else's channel. You can do it to your own channel, but you can't do it to someone else's channel. Now, I'm assuming that most of us at this point, if you're watching this series, it's probably because you want to manage some aspect of your own channel. So in your case, listen away. If you're looking to modify someone else's channel and you don't have access to it, well, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, you can't do it. So what we talked about in the last video was getting the project set up and getting things like an API key and your client credentials. So that way we can start going through and building our authentication aspect of our client. So at this point, I do want to point out the code will be available on GitHub. So there's going to be two types of people who might be watching this video. There might be a group of people who says, Alex, I want to just see how you wrote this code and why were you thinking what you were thinking? Why did you approach it the way you were approaching it? In that type of situation, I'm going to gear things a certain way towards you, right? So I'm going to let you know things that I might not let another user know who wasn't really caring about building everything from scratch. So if you're that type of person, what I'm going to start talking about is things like libraries I'm using and things about how I got around certain issues I was running into. If you're planning to be somebody where it's like, hey, I don't really care how you wrote it, I just want to use it, I'm going to gear that towards another conversation, which is don't necessarily worry about some of these finer details. This is only if you were actually developing it. A lot of that's already been worked out. I think it's great if you know how it works, but it's not necessarily important. So for example, dependencies. This library does have dependencies. It does use other libraries that come from Google that do different things. So they handle your authentication protocol. They'll do things like allow you to use different APIs and stuff like that. And so you're going to have to install those dependencies. If you want to know what those dependencies are from a person who might want to recreate this library, but for a different service, then you can go to my setup.py file. And inside that file, this is what you would use to install your particular version of this, so your library on your own local system. And if you go down to the install requires section, you will see that I need to use request. I need to use the Google API client, Python client library. And then I also need to use the Google oAuth library. And so each one of these is just different libraries that help us do different things with the client. With this one, this is primarily due to authentication, right? So this is just helping us do a lot of different things in the sense of building your client and authenticating stuff. And then you'll also be able to see here what aspects I was using from it. So I'm really using the Google API client for mostly the aspect of what would be the word? Media upload. I mean, there's other things too, but for the most part, that's primarily what you're going to be using it for. So if you wanted to clone the repo and you want to install this locally, then all you would do is pip install -e and it's going to be period. So this is if it wasn't available on PyPy. So when you do this one, you can install it in development mode where it doesn't necessarily install it in your local library. It basically creates a link. And so if you do pip install -e.i, it's going to go through and it's going to install all the aspects that it needs. So most of this I already have satisfied, so it went a lot quicker. If you don't have a lot of these requirements, it's going to take a little bit longer. So that's somebody who just wants to clone the repo and get started right away. And then, naturally too, I mean, you could, if you want, you could just do pip install, Google, what is it? Google auth, oAuth lib, something like that, right? And that will install the library as well. So that's if you want to do it manually yourself. But those are basically the libraries you're going to need. You're going to need requests because we're going to be making a lot of requests. Now, right now I have all my code in a folder called YouTube, and that's kind of my main directory that I store all my files. If you were creating this from scratch, you would want to create your own file, your own folder. So I'm going to create another one, just, make it as real life as possible. And we'll call this one YouTube, and we'll just call it YouTube tutorial, right? So even though this is the one you would be using, this is going to be the one that we're going to be using in our tutorials. And this is just more for the education process. So inside this file, we're going to need to create a new, or in this folder, we're going to have to create a new file, and we'll call that file client.py. This will house my main YouTube client. From here, we can start importing our libraries, and then we can also start defining our client and things that we want it to do. So we're going to need quite a few libraries. The first one is JSON. We're going to be working with a lot of JSON data. OS, I don't technically know if we need this one anymore. The only reason I don't think we need that is because I started using pathlib. So I was using OS to see if files exist and stuff like that, but I find pathlib is just a lot easier, and it already has the same built-in functionality that this one has. So I personally like using pathlib. That's just my opinion. And then we're going to use URL lib, and then it's going to be parse. It's because we're going to be doing parsing URLs and stuff like that. And then we're going to have to import request. This is because we're going to be making a lot of requests, obviously. Keep in mind, this is not a Python standard library. These are Python standard libraries. And then we're going to be importing Google specific libraries. And so we're going to say from Google, and then it's _auth _oAuth lib. And then we want flow import installed at flow. So this is a nice little thing that helps with the whole authorization process. So this will be able to take our client secret file, and it will be a nice, easy way where I can just call one method and it will go and start the authentication protocol for me. And then what we'll find is we can take the information from there and we can save it. So that's the first one we need. We are also going to need google.auth.transport.request. So they actually have their own little request aspect that you can use. And then we're going to take in the request object. We're going to also need Google oAuth2.credentials. So this will be a credentials object. If you hover over it, this is things where it's going to basically handle other aspects of our authentication. It's kind of like our main storage component, if you want to think about it like that, if that's maybe the right way to think about it. So this is doing the authorization, and it's going to return one of these. And then from here, there will be certain things, for example, where I will actually want to upload certain stuff. And so I'm going to need my API client, and then I'm going to do HTTP. And then I'm going to do import media file upload. So this is for my thumbnails. I use this for my thumbnails. And then I like to use type hinting now. And so I'm doing typing and then import dictionary, from typing import list, and then from typing import union. This will be more helpful when you start doing IntelliSense. Okay, then from here, we need to define our first class object. This will encapsulate all of our wonderful functionality under a single umbrella. We're gonna call that class YouTube client. And then when we initialize this client, we are going to have certain things happen. So the double underscore init method basically says, hey, every time I create this client object, I want certain things to happen. I might ask the user for certain keyword arguments, and I might want to store that as properties that we can then use later in our client object. So I will need an API key. As much as I don't want it, I'm going to need it in order to authenticate. You don't necessarily need a channel ID, but sometimes it's going to make operations a little bit easier. I will need a client secret path because with this one, that's pointing exactly where the content that I need for authentication is going to be at. And then also a state path would be nice too, because I'd like to know where you want me to store the stuff. And then with this one, your init method should return nothing. And I actually installed an extension the other day. It's called generate doc strings, and I love it. Look at that. Doesn't work all the time, so there's some little bugs here and there. But for the most part, I love it because it makes writing my doc strings 10 times easier. So this one is initialize the client. However, you gotta be really careful. So when you do this, you notice how it doesn't look all fancy? It's because you have to put these little underscores underneath. So now that becomes highlighted, or it's a bigger header. And then if you indent this, do you notice how it's now all of a sudden coded? You actually have to not indent it. If you don't indent it, it won't do it. And then you have to put line breaks in between. So that's a nice, easy way of making it a little bit more user-friendly. And then I like to have a usage section. And then with usage, you could indent it to do the code. I find this actually looks a little bit more consistent, and you will actually sometimes see different behavior depending on what color theme you're using. And so all I'm gonna say is, hey, this is gonna take an API key. Now, technically I'm missing other ones like the client secret path, but I'm gonna be a little bit lazy. Channel ID, yeah. And then we'll say channel ID. And the nice thing about this, that will now highlight it correctly. So you don't get those kind of weird syntax issues that I've gotten it. So yeah, some people might complain, well, that's not standard Python. You know, that's not the doc strings that you like. Well, if you want the little IntelliSense display, you kind of have to do that. I haven't found a nice workaround. Supposedly they're working on functionality to fix that, but I haven't seen it yet. Okay, so that will be our initialization process. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to now define some of the properties that were passed through, right? And so what we're going to say is define the channel specific data. And so we'll say self.api key will equal the API key that is passed through. Self.channel ID will equal the channel ID that is passed through. We're going to have our API services. And so this is just easy ways for us to build URLs. And so this one is going to be https://www.googleapis.com. And then we're going to have our API service. That should be YouTube. And then we're going to also need API version. So there are different versions of the API. They change all the time, but we want v3. And then we're going to have an upload service. For right now, just put it like that. We're probably going to change that in a little bit, but for right now, it's fine. So you've got channel specific data, API services. I call the next session like session properties. I don't know if that's the best naming call it, but it works. So with this one, we're going to have a self.client secret file. Now with this one, I'm going to use pathlib, and then it's going to be path, the client secret path, and then I want the absolute version. So this is a nice kind of neat thing about pathlib is it actually works for both Windows and Mac and Linux. And so it does a lot of the key things that are necessary when it comes to making sure your paths work regardless of what operating system they're on. So that's why I love this library, because I know I have users who are both on Mac, Linux, and Windows. And so by having this module, I can now save myself a ton of headache by just calling one method instead of having to do 90 different things just to make sure it works. I really hate file paths with a burning passion. And then we're going to have a YouTube state file. This is going to be pathlib, path. This is going to be the state path that we pass through. And again, we're going to do absolute. Okay, so that's that one. And then we're going to define something called a data folder. So the data folder path is just a default directory that I store all of my data in. I don't know if I built in yet to create the folder. If I didn't, then I'll just add it later. And then if you kind of want type hinting for this stuff, it's actually kind of nice. You can actually do, what is it? Pathlib.path. So that's a nice way where down the road you can now get certain IntelliSense features that you wouldn't not necessarily have. And then this one's going to be path. It's a path object. And then this one is going to be the file that we're currently in. It's going to be the parent. There's a better way to do this. I'm sure there is, but I haven't found it yet. And then it's going to be join path and then data. So this is basically just going to point to my data folder. That's all I'm doing. And then from here, we're going to have something called credentials. And so self.credentials will equal, and we're going to have a method called oAuth workflow, and that will return a credentials object. So from here, we've defined our init method. Let's start moving on to our next component. Next, underscore save state. So this is a private method. And so with this one, I think it returns, what did I have it return? It does, it returns a dictionary. So with this one, we're gonna have it return a dictionary. Wait, did I move it? Oh, there it is. Okay, sorry, I was moving my nodes. And with this one, we're gonna create a new variable. We'll call it state dictionary. Bam. And it's gonna have basically 3 key value pairs. One is gonna be called client. The next one will be credentials, and then it's going to be the client ID. And then this one is going to be a credentials object. The next one will be your client secrets, and then this will be self.credentials, and then see, now we get nice little type hinting and IntelliSense. That's why you want to do that. It makes your life easier, I promise. And then this, I want my client secret. Very useful. And I found that one. I was like, oh, love it. RefreshToken is going to be self.credentials, and then it's going to be RefreshToken. So once we have that, we will want to save that information to our session file. So open the state file and save the state. And so with this one, we're going to say with open, and then it's going to be self.youtube state file, right plus. So if the file doesn't exist, then create it. And then we'll give it an alias of a state file. And then with this, we're going to use our JSON module. We're going to call dump. And then we're going to say our object is going to equal our state dictionary. And then our file will be our state file. Bam, just like that. So now we've written in, for the most part, a mechanism to save our state. We will return our state dictionary once it's done. Not really necessary, but I guess I could just return none if I didn't want to. Ooh, don't want to delete it. Don't want to delete it. Okay, there we go. All right. How long have we been talking? Okay, we'll do a few more. Let's do the workflow. oAuth workflow. Woo! We're going to call this our oAuth workflow, and we'll just have it be self right now. And then with this one, that doesn't make sense. Oh, this is one that it can return multiple items. Ugh. Ugh. No, it should still return credentials though. Well, you know what? For right now, we'll just have it return credentials because that's what it really should be returning. Okay, so this is going to be handling our authentication workflow. So this will do things like refresh the token if it needs to. So if we already have a state file there, then what it will do is it will refresh, or at least we'll try to refresh our token. And then our other one will grab our client secret file and it will check if it exists. And if it does, then what it will do is, what is it? It will run the authentication protocol. So first things first, we will say if self.YouTube state file. Now, this is the cool thing about Pathlet, exist. Just like that, we will know if it exists. That's why I love this module so much. And so if it exists, then we're going to have another method called RefreshToken. So if your state file exists, then do your RefreshToken. If our self.client secret file.exist, then, so basically in this case, if you don't have a state file, it's going to go here and it's going to say, okay, well, do you have a client secret file? And if you do, let's create a new flow. And so our new flow will be our installed app flow. And then it's going to be from client secrets file. And then with this one, it's going to be the self.client secret file. And then I think we have to pass, oh yeah, that's that weird one. So then we have to pass through our scopes. And so we already have the URL and I don't want to risk mistyping it. So I'm just going to grab it. So let's grab it. And so this will be our scope. And then from here, what we can do is we can return the flow.run console. And then this will actually return some other stuff too, if I remember correctly. No. Oh yeah, it does. So this one's going to return. Okay, so we need union because this one technically can return multiple things. I forgot about that. Could do credentials and it can be installed app flow. Okay, perfect. So if the state file exists, try and refresh the token. If there is no state file, then check to see if there is a client secret file. And if there is, then go through that little process. So that's that portion. This is basically going to be doing the bulk of it. So once we've done that, we can now talk about our refresh token and our validate token. So let's do those two methods. We'll run it, see what happens, and then we'll call it quits. So we're going to define a new method. We'll call it refresh token. This will not take any arguments, and it's actually going to return a credentials object. And then from here, we will say this will be create a new request. Now this is an atypical request. This is the Google request. Request equals request. Perfect. So notice how this one's coming from Google. Okay. And then we're going to load the file. So we'll call this credentials. No, lowercase, credentials. No. God. This will equal a credentials object. And we're going to say from authorized user file. This will take a file name. which will be our self.youtube state file. So that will contain our refresh token, that will contain our access token, well, not our access token, it will contain our client ID, our client secret, and so on. Technically, I've been thinking about this one. You know, if you're passing me through that kind of stuff, really, I don't think that needs to be saved. I was doing that more just for my system. More than likely, I will be getting rid of this only because you're already passing it through in that client secret path. So more than likely, this is not going to be here because, again, I don't want to ask for more info than I have to. The only thing I would really like is the refresh token. Okay, so now that we have that, let's go and what else do I need? We are gonna take our credentials object and we're gonna refresh the token. So that will say credentials, and then there's a refresh method, and then you just pass through that request object. A little bit awkward, but I mean, if that's how it is, that's how it is. But it is, you know, to me, that's, I wouldn't necessarily think to pass through the request, but it is what it is. And then from here, return credentials. Okay. And then we're going to do a underscore validate token. So this is just a way to see if the token is valid or not, because there's going to be times, you know, your token does expire. I hate to be the bearer of bad news. So the nice thing is, though, it actually makes this really easy to do that. So there's a valid property with your credentials. And so if it's valid, great, return true. And then else self.refresh token. And then return true. I might work on this a little bit more. I haven't had any issues yet, thankfully. It's actually been very reliable and I haven't had any issues. But there might have to be a little bit more testing just to make sure that doesn't potentially run into any issues. But yeah, I mean, for the most part, that's really the authentication aspect. And really at this point, you have enough to test it out. So what we're going to do is we're going to test it out. So we're going to create a new file. We'll call it use client.tutorial.py. Okay. And then from here, we're going to do a couple different things. So from config parser, import config parser, from YouTube tutorial, import, no, YouTube tutorial.client, import YouTube client. And then we're going to do is config. It's going to equal new instance of our config parser. And this is where I forget what the code was. I'm going to copy that, make my life easier. Boom. So this is actually pretty identical to what we were doing when we were writing it. So create a new instance of your config parser. Now in this one, we were writing to it. So we were adding stuff to it and we were setting certain information. In this situation, we're reading our particular config file. Now notice that this is not technically right, so I need to make sure I change that. And then from here, you will notice that I have all my information kind of pre-populated. I'm gonna double check it because I know how I am. I will misspell it. Okay, channel ID. Oh, of course, see? See? That's why you check it. And then you got your tutorial. Good, good, good. Hopefully that's everything we need. So here, read the config file and load the values. Okay, and then we're gonna create a new instance of the client. So we are gonna say, let's create a new variable, call it YouTube session. It will equal our YouTube client object. And then we're gonna start passing through our variables. So we're gonna need an API key. We have a channel ID. Well, guess what? That's going to be our channel ID. And then we're going to need our client secret path. That will be our client secret path. And then we're going to need a state path that will equal our state path. So hopefully that's all we need. Yeah. It's funny, you know, you write the stuff and you still never remember how it works. Okay. Oh, I think I put in the wrong one. Okay, perfect. Okay, so naturally, this is what you're gonna see the first time you log in. It's gonna say, hey, you're trying to access this. You don't have permission to do that. Oh, but we do. So there's a bug now in Microsoft Edge when I updated it. So now when you open up a new tab, it all squishes. But if you do that, it comes right back. So I'm gonna go here. This is for my YouTube account. And then this is gonna pop up. Because we haven't verified our app, this will always pop up. Until you're verified, it's not gonna not pop up. So you just have to accept it. You just do advanced and then go to Sigma Channel Management. And then you go here, it's gonna ask that, do you wanna access this? And you say, of course, it's my channel. And then it's gonna have this code. Copy the code, go back to Visual Studio Code, paste it into the terminal, and just like that, we should be good to go. And if we look here, let's see, oh goodness. Where did it save? Well, where did I specify it? State.sample. Configs YouTube state sample. Did it not save? I have my credentials, so that's fine. It didn't save. No. It could have been 2 that I didn't specify something correctly. Oh, you gotta love when it doesn't work. Let's see what happens. Oh, I know what it is. I never saved it. I never saved the state. That's why. Where did I save it? Credentials view. Oh, I think I didn't do it in the init method. That's why. Damn it. Okay, I forgot to put in the init method. I'm like, wait a minute. It's supposed to be saving it, and I know it should be saving it. So now we need to actually save the state, which I should have done from the get-go. So if self.youtube_state_file.exist, if that equals false, that means we don't have it, so it doesn't exist. In that case, I want to call my save state method. So we're gonna run it again, just to make sure that it works and that it gives us the response that we were expecting. Now, because notice how it didn't save it, now we have to do this all over again. So that's kind of the downside about this is if you don't save it, every time you run your script, you would have to technically run this. So that's why I think saving that refresh token is very important because naturally it's going to save you a lot of headache. And then it does last for a while. Okay, perfect. So now it created our sample file. And inside our sample file, we have our client ID, our client secret, and then our refresh token. And with that, perfect. I thought I was going to go over a lot longer than that. With that, that actually does this particular video. So if you have any questions about the authentication aspect of our client object, by all means, ask away. I will say next video is probably going to be just common operations. So most of the operations we're going to be concerned about is getting data. So we're going to see how to get videos, get playlists, get comments and stuff like that. And then we'll transition into uploading. So like not necessarily uploading, but creating new content and then modifying an existing content. And then also talk a little bit about deleting. There's very few delete operations I do. Most time it's straightforward modification, and inserting. Oh, not that. What I'm going to do next is, and this is also a great way if you want to see how to delete a project, because naturally at this point I am done with this, so I don't need it. Oh, God forbid. Go to project settings. I think it's this one. You can shut down your project. So when you shut it down, you lose access to everything. So at this point, it shuts it down. And then once you shut it down, you can then delete it. I think it's something that it's like it doesn't automatically delete. So like these are all the ones that were pending deletion. So they're no longer active, but they're not deleted. So you have them for like 30 days before they're deleted basically. So in the next video, I'm going to assume that all of us have our credentials and stuff like that. So I won't be covering that again. And then I'll be using mine to show you content that how I see it when I'm on my channel, just so that way you guys are kind of a little bit familiar with what the content looks like, what are some things that I have to kind of keep an eye out for, and what are easy ways to kind of identify content as it kind of flows in. So again, at this point, if you have any questions, by all means, ask away, do all that kind of fun stuff. I will upload the content to you GitHub. In fact, I think I'll just upload it right now. I don't know if I made it public or not. So tutorial stuff. And we will look at it. It was actually a lot of fun doing that library. Some are more fun than other ones. Some are not. Bam. Okay. I'll see if I made it public or not. Oh, it's still private. Yeah. Oh, crap. I didn't want to put the tutorial stuff in there. Okay, well, I'll deal with that later. All right, so yeah, next video we'll start going over the endpoints and start pulling in some data. So we'll see you in the next video.